In a quiet high school somewhere in the heart of America, students gathered in the auditorium for what they assumed would be just another ordinary assembly. Laughter buzzed through the room, especially from a group of teenagers who had long made it their habit to mock and belittle anyone who looked or acted differently. Their latest target was a soft-spoken black woman, modestly dressed, waiting quietly near the stage. She seemed nervous, out of place even, and to them an easy subject for ridicule. They had no idea who she was. But within moments, as she stepped onto the podium and began to speak, everything changed. The moment she began to speak, the room fell silent. Her voice was calm, clear, and steady, not what the students had expected. She didn't raise her voice, nor did she call out anyone by name. Instead, she began to tell a story. It was about a little girl who grew up in a rough neighborhood not far from where they sat now. A girl who wore hand-me-down clothes, who was laughed at for her hair, her skin, and the way she spoke. A girl who was told she wasn't smart enough, not pretty enough, not good enough. That girl had been mocked, isolated, and bullied, sometimes by classmates, sometimes even by teachers. But the girl didn't give up. She kept reading, studying, dreaming, and despite the odds, she became the first in her family to go to college. She earned her degree in education and later a master's. She returned to the very community that once doubted her, not for revenge, but for change. At this point, some students in the audience began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. A few of them looked at each other, realizing the story wasn't just a metaphor. She paused. Then she looked up at the audience, not with anger, but with compassion, and said, "That little girl was me." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The same students who had laughed at her earlier now sat frozen, realizing the weight of their actions. The woman standing before them, once a victim of ridicule, was now their teacher, their mentor, their mirror. But her story didn't end there, because every day, in every class she would teach from that moment forward, a new chapter would begin, written not just by her, but by each student willing to listen, reflect, and grow. After the assembly, the bell rang, but no one moved right away. The usual noise and chatter were replaced by a thick, thoughtful silence. Some students walked out with their heads down. Others lingered behind, their expressions unreadable. A few of the bullies, those who had laughed the loudest, avoided eye contact, pretending to be unfazed. But something had shifted. In the following days, Ms. Parker, yes, that was her name, began her first week as a full-time teacher at the school. She taught English, but her lessons often wove in more than grammar and literature. She spoke about finding voice through writing, about characters who struggled but endured, and somehow her classroom felt different, warmer, safer. Some students remained distant, unsure how to face the woman they had once ridiculed. But others slowly began to lean in. A girl who rarely spoke started staying after class, asking timid questions. A boy known for skipping school showed up 3 days in a row and actually submitted an essay, his first of the year. One afternoon, as Miss Parker was gathering her things, a folded piece of paper was left on her desk. It read, in shaky handwriting, "I'm sorry, I was one of them, but your story made me want to be someone else." She folded the note carefully, her eyes misting, and tucked it into her bag. She didn't need to know who wrote it. The fact that it was written at all meant something had begun. And yet, the story wasn't over, because not every student had changed. Not every heart had opened, and the world outside those classroom walls still carried shadows of the same prejudice, the same cruelty she had once faced. But now Miss Parker was not alone, and neither were the students learning to see her and themselves in a new light. Every morning she stepped into her classroom was another step onto that podium. Weeks passed. The initial buzz around the new teacher with the powerful story began to fade, but the quiet impact of her presence only grew. Ms. Parker kept teaching. She corrected essays with care, asked open-ended questions that made students pause and think, and really listened when they spoke. Some students started staying after class not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Then there was Marcus, 17 years old, witty, sharp-tongued, one of the ringleaders of the mocking laughter that day in the auditorium. He hadn't apologized, hadn't written any notes. He sat in the back of the class, arms crossed, usually pretending not to care. But he never skipped her class. Not once. One day, Ms. Parker assigned a personal narrative essay. Tell a story about something that changed you. Most students groaned. Marcus didn't say a word. But that night, he stayed up until 3 a.m., staring at a blank page. Something in him itched to be said, but he didn't know how to say it. Not yet. The deadline came and went. No paper from Marcus. After class, Miss Parker called out gently, "Marcus, can I talk to you for a minute?" He turned, defensive. "I ain't got nothing to write about." She smiled, not the smug kind of smile, but the kind that says, "I see more in you than you see in yourself." "I think you do," she said softly. "And when you're ready, I'll still be here." He didn't respond, just shoved his hands into his hoodie and walked out. But that night he opened his notebook, and he wrote one sentence. "The woman I laughed at turned out to be the one who sees me better than anyone ever has." It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, Miss Parker always said, were the most powerful part of any story. Marcus didn't turn in the essay the next day, or the day after that. He still sat in the back, hoodie up, headphones half in. But there was something different now. A tension in the way he tapped his pen against the desk, how his eyes followed Miss Parker more closely than before. He wasn't zoning out anymore. He was watching, waiting, wrestling. At home, things weren't easy. His mom worked double shifts. His older brother was in and out of juvenile detention. No one asked Marcus how his day was. No one read his words. Except maybe her. One Friday afternoon, when most students had already filed out, Marcus hung back. He stood at her desk awkwardly, a folded paper in his hand, creased at the corners, like it had been opened and closed too many times. "I wrote something," he muttered, barely meeting her eyes. She took it gently. "Can I read it now?" He shrugged. "Yeah, I guess." She unfolded the paper. His handwriting was rough, but the words were raw and real. "I used to laugh because it was easier than listening, easier than feeling. You stood there like you didn't hear us, but you did, and you still showed up. I don't know what kind of strength that takes, but I want to know." Miss Parker looked up, eyes full. She didn't say much, just, "Thank you." That took courage. Marcus shifted, uncomfortable. "It's not finished." She smiled. "Good. Neither is your story." He nodded and left without another word. Later that evening, Miss Parker sat alone in her classroom, reading his words again. She looked at the empty chairs, the scratched-up desks, the posters peeling slightly at the edges, and she didn't feel tired. Some battles had no clear victories, no applause, just small, quiet moments like this. The next Monday, a substitute teacher showed up for one of her classes. The students asked where Miss Parker was. The sub said only, she had something important to do. No one knew what that meant, but Marcus did. He'd seen her Friday evening, slipping a manila envelope into the office mailbox labeled District Writing Showcase. Inside Marcus's essay. The story hasn't ended. She hasn't told him it was submitted. He hasn't decided if he wants it shared. And she hasn't stopped believing in the unfinished. Because in classrooms like hers, and in hearts like his, some of the most powerful stories are the ones still being written. Weeks later, as spring sunlight began to slip through the classroom windows, a notice appeared on the bulletin board. Congratulations to the finalists of the District Writing Showcase. There were only 3 names on the list. One of them read, Marcus Reed, 11th grade, The Woman on the Podium. Marcus stood still for a long moment, staring at the paper. A few classmates glanced at him, surprised, but said nothing. He walked quietly back into the classroom and stopped at Ms. Parker's desk. You submitted my essay? He asked, not angry, just uncertain. She looked up with a calm, knowing smile. You wrote something worth hearing. The world deserves to hear it. He didn't say anything at first. Then he nodded, a small, steady nod that said, I trust you. Okay, he said, I'll read it, in front of everyone, if you're sitting in the front row. She smiled wider, her eyes soft with pride. Oh, Marcus, I'll be in the very front, right in the center. That evening, under the soft glow of the auditorium lights, Marcus stood on stage, holding the paper he had once crumpled, then folded again and again. He took a deep breath. In the front row, Miss Parker sat quietly, hands folded, her smile unwavering. She didn't need to speak. Her presence alone said everything. And Marcus began to read. No longer the kid in the back of the class. No longer one of the ones who laughed, but a young man reclaiming his voice. And in that moment, Miss Parker was no longer just the woman who had been mocked. She was a teacher, a mirror, a catalyst. She had turned cruelty into courage and taught a young man how to rewrite his story.